Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a really fascinating international court case from 1950. It all boiled down to one simple question, but with absolutely huge consequences. What happens when an empire falls apart and the organization that was supposed to be supervising it just vanishes?
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We're actually going to follow the exact roadmap the court itself used. First, we'll set the scene. Then, we'll lay out the three crucial questions the UN posed. And finally, we'll walk through the court's answers, one by one. Let's get into it.
Okay, so our story kicks off in a place that you and I know today as Namibia, but back then, it was on the map as Southwest Africa.
So here's the deal. After Germany lost World War I, this territory wasn't just handed over to the winners. No, instead it was put into this brand new international system. And that created this weird kind of legal limbo, right? A situation that just blew up when the entire system's architect, the League of Nations, basically disappeared after World War II.
Now, this is really important. The system wasn't about ownership. The core idea, and you can find this in Article 22 of the League's covenant, was that this guardianship, or tutelage, was a sacred trust of civilization. I mean, for the time, that was a totally groundbreaking concept.
Okay, so here's where it all comes to a head. The League of Nations is gone. And South Africa says, hey, the supervisor's gone, so our obligations are gone too. We can do whatever we want with this territory now. But the brand new United Nations, well, they strongly disagreed. And that, right there, set the stage for a massive legal showdown.
So to try and settle this whole thing, the UN General Assembly went straight to the International Court of Justice, and they asked three super specific questions, which, basically created the whole framework for this historic decision. Question 1. Do South Africa's obligations still stand? Question 2, does the territory have to be placed in the UN's new trusteeship system? And question 3, who actually gets to decide what happens to the territory status?
All right, let's dig into that first question. And this one was really the big one, the most fundamental piece of the puzzle.
South Africa's argument was, on the surface, pretty simple. They said, look, the League of Nations gave us the mandate. They were the mandator. Now they're gone, so the mandate must be gone too. Makes sense, right? A neat, tidy little argument. But was it right?
Well, the court came back with a resounding, almost unanimous, yes. The obligations absolutely did not just vanish into thin air. And the reasoning behind this? It's actually pretty profound. The court basically said this mandate wasn't some simple contract you could just tear up because one party disappeared. No, its entire purpose, its core purpose, was to protect the inhabitants. That created what they called an international sacred trust that was bigger than the League of Nations. It had to outlive it. So that begs the question, right? If the trust still exists, who's the supervisor? Well, the court had an answer for that too. They pointed straight to the UN General Assembly as the legal successor, ready to take over the duties of the old League Council. So the obligation to be supervised, it didn't just evaporate, it transferred.
Okay, so that leads us right into the next logical question. If the supervision continues under the UN, does that mean South Africa has to put the territory into the UN's new, more formal trusteeship system? To put it another way, was this whole trusteeship thing optional, or was it a legal requirement? You can bet the UN was really hoping the court would say it was an obligation.
But on this point, the court's answer was different. It was a close call, but by a narrow majority, they ruled no, it was not a legal requirement.
And their whole reasoning came down to the nitty-gritty of the UN Charter's wording. They pointed out that the language was permissive. It said territories may be placed under the system, not shall be placed. And, this is the key part, it required an agreement. Well, an agreement implies that both sides have to consent. So the bottom line was, the UN couldn't just force South Africa's hand. It was something they hoped would happen, but it wasn't a binding legal obligation.
Okay, so let's recap where we are. The mandate is still alive, but trusteeship isn't mandatory. That leaves a huge question hanging in the air. Who has the final say on changing the international status of Southwest Africa?
Could South Africa, for example, just go ahead and absorb the territory, make it part of their own country, which, by the way, they had made pretty clear they wanted to do? This really was the million-dollar question.
And once again, the court came back with a crystal clear, unanimous no. Absolutely not. South Africa could not act alone.
And the logic here followed that same principle of succession we talked about. Think about it. The original mandate couldn't be changed without the League of Nations' consent. So, since the UN was the League's successor, that power simply transferred over. To make any changes, South Africa needed a partner at the table, and that partner was now the United Nations.
All right, so let's pull this all together. After wrestling with these three massive questions, what was the court's final binding judgment? What was the final takeaway?
In essence, the court performed a really delicate balancing act. It confirmed, number one, that the international mandate for Southwest Africa was still in effect. That meant South Africa's obligations to the people there also continued. Number two, the United Nations was now the new supervisor. And number three, while that formal trusteeship system was optional, changing the territory's status absolutely was not. South Africa could not just do what it wanted without the UN's consent. You couldn't have the rights of the mandate without the responsibilities. It was a package deal.
Now, this judgment was huge. It established a vital principle of international accountability. But it also set the stage for decades, and I mean decades, of conflict over the future of Namibia. And that leaves us with one final, very provocative question to think about.